I'm good.
I was stressed out about what to wear because hip t-shirt that you made, and so I spent like 15 minutes trying to figure out, and I ended up with this Warriors jersey because I was thinking about what all the sports teams are going to do with the way baseball season's playing out, and I don't know about football, but I'm a basketball fan and a season ticket holder. I was trying to figure out what's going to happen next year. COVID mask on, got that look, starting to
You're set
practice.
for everything for this conversation, I can tell.
Yeah. Right. How, as individuals, we can think about equity in remote work environments. And so I think we were going to do a little bit of an exchange of questions going back and forth on this topic.
Gotcha. Sounds good. So individuals building over the next few weeks to teams and organizations. Got it. Got it. All right. So I got a question for you.
All
Kick
right.
us off. So I think a lot about this, obviously stepping out of a school district or stepping out of school districts where, there's still that mentality of kind of the 9 to 5, you clock in, clock out. There's still a little bit of that going on. So why do you think it's taken so long, or why does it take so long for people to buy into the remote work environment?
As a result, the work we were given gives us some sort of a semblance of order, right? So 9 to 5 kind of gives us some semblance that we're kind of in the work mindset. With the bell schedules and everything, we've kind of been trained that way. It's hard in a remote work environment because we're looking for that sense of routine, and we don't put into practice the things we need to do to actually develop the routine. So for myself, especially when I've been in this situation, I would say my routine is wake up in the morning, drink some coffee, drink some water, meditate for 20 minutes. And I know that's setting me up to go to work, just like I used to commute 30 minutes just to get to the office. And so that's kind of my commute to going to work. And I just learned to put different routines in place so that I can transition my mindset towards kind of work mode.
It's interesting. As you were speaking, it reminds me a little bit of like, how when we go to airports or we went to airports prior to 9/11, there was a way you just kind of went through. I remember like when my grandparents came back from Disney World, they went to Disney World or something like that with my younger cousins, and you were able to go through the gate and like see them when they got out of the gate. And that was like the routine. Now, post 9/11, people are like, oh, we're not going to, this whole taking off your shoes thing is not going to stick and stay. You're not going to take off your jacket forever. It's just temporary. But no, that's our new routine, right? And so that's the new way of doing it. So I think this is the adjustment period, what you're describing. And I think now I'm finding that rhythm as well. Like I tried some like work sprints for 30 minutes and try to get chunks of work done. And then I said, no, that kind of worked, but didn't get me through everything I wanted to get done. So chunking my day a little bit different was another strategy. And then I really realized what I needed was quiet. I have 2 new coworkers in my house, they age at 2 and 6. And so I needed time and space where they were not awake and not at work, on my nerves, that is. And so I actually get up a little bit earlier now to do the meditation, drink my water. I do a lot of my push-ups in the morning, and then I'm able to write. And so like I get a large chunk of work done between like 5:30 and like 8:15, because that's when the pitter patter of the feet come down the stairs. So that way I'm able to get some things done. But it took a while to get to that transition.
Yeah, I was even thinking just on the travel front, when I was on the road all the time, I would just get up at 4 o'clock in the morning on a Monday to catch a 6 a.m. flight and then be on the road all week. And then I knew I was coming home on Friday at 10 p.m. And that sounds like a horrible routine, but that was my routine. And I look forward to it. Even as we transitioned to being at home, I was like, oh man, it'd be cool if I could just go to the airport on Monday mornings, because that's what I was kind of trained to do. From your perspective, from an equity lens, what are some of the things that you're letting go of and kind of introducing into remote work conditions that you may not have like been comfortable with in an in-person environment? And more specifically, I think last week we talked a little bit about t-shirts versus ties, or the words that we feel comfortable using.
Right.
I noticed even since you and I started talking more, like your words are just more casual and natural. It's not using kind of the quote what we considered professional language a lot of times. But I just feel like our connection has been more real because we were able to talk that way. So I'd be curious what you're hanging on to and what you're letting go of.
Yeah, so I guess that there's two different pictures, and I wish I had two different pictures, right? So one picture I have in my head is a picture of like my old office, shiny tables, like cherry wood tables with like eight perfectly, kind of eight seats around this table, perfectly separated. Everyone had like their agenda and their pens. So you walk into this space that is pretty stuffy, right? Like I think, unfortunately, in some school environments, that's kind of the norm. We walk into a meeting space, we sit in a certain seat, we get used to that routine, even to the point where I just remember sometimes if you sat in the wrong seat, there was never an assigned seat, but if you sat in the wrong seat and you sat in someone's particular seat they sat in every week, it kind of threw the meeting off temporarily, right? So just imagining that kind of space. Now my space is a computer. I have a notepad, I have my iPad, and I have other like video equipment like next to me, and that's now my workspace. And so by transitioning to this space, there's a few things that I took with me and a few things that I left. One of the things I took with me was the idea of holding on to perspective and people. So I feel like, what happened in a lot of meetings that I started to go to, there was always someone's position or perspective that was more valued, and that was heard a little bit more deeply. Now in a virtual space, I'm able to take everyone's perspective and the person with me as I'm thinking about their consideration. So I'm being more intentional how I'm listening to every individual and the perspective they present, because that allows me to get a fuller picture of what I'm attempting to hear. The other piece that I found interesting is that I want to find a way, and I've tried to find a way to increase my wait time and processing, because I feel that gap between speakers allows me to really appreciate the words that are coming from people, to make sure I understand what they're asking and what they need. And so I know a lot of times we're fighting for airtime in meetings in person. We're waiting for us to jump in and get our thoughts across. But, now with this like space and this virtual platform, it's more equitable if we are, and being fair to others by listening to their complete thought and giving space for ideas to breathe a little bit. And then I think the last thing, which is a little trickier, which I know was very commonplace depending on district offices and buildings that we worked in, there was always a voice that seemed to have just a little bit more cachet. There's always that person who, regardless of the conversation, they were listened to a little bit deeper, and usually it had something to do with their title. Now you're able to listen to the voices, all voices, and lift them up differently. And you can do that intentionally on how you call on or you articulate your points of view and how you engage people virtually that you may not have been able to do in a traditional work experience. So I'm leaving the, kind of the cachet at the office, but I'm leaving this experience of being able to listen to and lift all voices to the virtual space.
A lot of the leaders that I've been interviewing of late have been commenting similarly that there's more opportunities to call on people that they normally didn't in the past. I grabbed this lemon again because I have this incredible lemon tree in the backyard, and it produces a ton of lemons. And you had this metaphor last time about the cactus and the rose bush, and I know that my lemon tree, I actually need to prune it pretty fiercely in order for it to produce more fruit, like a lot more fruit. So I was thinking about your metaphor the other day, and I was like, even though there's some fruit there, if I don't prune it, I actually don't create 3 times more fruit.
Right.
And sometimes you kind of prune things that feel tough to prune because you're like, oh, that's the fruit of my efforts. But sometimes you kind of have to let go of certain things in order to create more fruit. Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to, I guess, pressure test your or extend your analogy a little bit. And I'd love to hear what you would say about that in reference to your cactus and rosebush analogy, because I really do like that one.
Yeah, yeah, I appreciate the extension. I think, Anthony, there's actually a third tree or plant that I would add to this, and it would be a sunflower, right? So, and this is, hence Liberate Ed, Liberated, like the t-shirt today. So like the next level, the next piece beyond equity is this idea of liberation, right? And make sure people are able to become free. And that's part of what you're speaking to, is like clipping the edges that are potentially holding people back, or just making it a perfect shape and allowing it to grow in the way that it wants to. Just like a sunflower needs a certain amount of water, a certain amount of sun. It opens and closes. It needs certain attention, but allow it to be itself and allow it to be free. So I think in a workplace environment, that shows up where different people have different ways of communicating, virtually or in person, but finding the right way to kind of prune the edges to, open them up to grow and amplify their voice differently is kind of the art behind this that we have to really examine and figure out how to do better.
I am kind of annoyed that you don't have a hope shirt on, because I had like this whole line prepared around like dope hope or something, and now like you totally screwed up my joke.
So thinking of, you lost a little bit there. So speaking of losses and gains here, what are some things that you believe that we are gaining or losing by working in this remote working environment? What do you see from your seat, from your vantage point?
I'm gonna tie it into your shirt, man, because I'm gonna say that I feel so much more liberated in this environment than when I was working in the office. Because when I think about what work freedom means to me, it's not working from 9 to 5. Work freedom to me means that I can work on things when I'm in the mood to work on them. And sometimes, just because I have some calendar blocked out on, something blocked out on my calendar that says writing time on Wednesday at 11 a.m., doesn't mean that I could just trigger my body to want to write at that time. And so I found it to be really comforting to know that I'm in a work environment where I can adjust my personal and my work life to meet the needs and my moods and all of the things that go around being energized and productive and inspired and balancing. And I think what I found is that it requires a lot more reflection around what my days and weeks look like than I had in the past. But as I was reflecting on this morning, I thought, actually, I did reflect a lot in the past when I was in my car driving to a building, on the plane, going from one city to the other, even going from one office to another for a meeting. I thought, there were little moments that I had, and what kind of stinks about kind of back-to-back Zoom is there is none of that space, right? So it's kind of seconds between one meeting and the other, and I think that's where we feel exhausted.
It's interesting that you said, the ebbs and flows of your energy is what I heard you speak to, right? So like, when are the moments where you feel like I have a ton of energy to crank out this blog post versus like right now I actually need to listen to this podcast or eat food, like there's just a different way of doing it. This is a quick follow-up question to that. Like, so where have you found your ebbs and flows? Like where does your energy, like when do you find where you have the biggest burst? Are you a morning person, afternoon person, night person? Or does it change depending on like the day before?
It's been shifting. Right now, I get up at 5 a.m. and I need a couple hours of just kind of quiet time, and it has nothing to do with like what I do. Sometimes I respond to emails, sometimes I check the news, definitely do my morning routine of meditations, but it's that space where you're trying to figure out like what you're trying to accomplish for the day or the week. So then after that, I would say just around this time is when, I get of like, okay, I've been up for 7 hours now, right? And, I think the reason you and I decided to take this approach to this conversation is because another presentation would be really exhausting at this point. And so we're giving people visibility into the types of lunch conversations or hallway conversations people might have that are still like the memories that create a work condition for you. Mm-hmm. So I do appreciate this time that you and I make available to everybody else to join us.
Yeah. And speaking of joining us, there's some folks out there. I see some comments coming in. If you have questions, drop them in the chat. We might have some time to get to them. We want to invite you into our lunch chat and conversation. But Anthony, I think there's a bigger question now about duos that you have. Something about duos.
Oh, yeah. So the question I had was, or is, which duo or group best represents the kind of relationship you want to have? And if you're thinking about anything between you and I, please don't say Rush Hour. All right. So
what is it good for?
So I wanted to see if you had to like describe the best relationship.
Yeah.
In a movie, that like the relationship you aspire for. Mm-hmm. Right? What movie best represents that?
Ooh, movie. Interesting. So this was tough. This question was tough because I actually oscillated on a couple of different things. One, because I just finished episode 8. I haven't gotten to 9 and 10 of The Last Dance with the Chicago Bulls. I haven't seen it all. So instantly my mind went to Scotty and Michael, but that's not a movie. But Scotty and Michael's dynamic was special. And then I went to food. So I was thinking, like, what is the best food combination, which we have to talk about another time. Great weekend of cooking, just really good weekend of cooking. But, like, you can't have peanut butter without jelly. So I was thinking, like, peanut butter and jelly sandwich. That is a relationship you just, except for those that are allergic to peanut butter, I understand. But it's hard to have just a jelly sandwich, to be completely honest. But now to go to movies. Like, the best movie duo. Oh, man. Well, you know what? I have to go with Bad Boys, Will Smith and Martin Lawrence. I think the relationship they had, the friendship that was there, the trust that was there, the moments where they gave each other very explicative language-filled feedback, I thought was strong. But, hey, I didn't see Bad Boys 2, or the last Bad Boys. But in general, I think the relationship allowed them to thrive. I don't know. Who do you have?
I know this was my question, and it was harder than I thought, too. So I came up with Fast and Furious, and I chose Fast and Furious because Vin Diesel is kind of a bad guy, right? And Paul Walker was the undercover cop. And what I liked about it is they both had different intentions, but they had what I would describe as a human code. And so when they got together, they uncovered each other's human code, and they realized that they had a lot more similarities than they had differences. And I think that, just going back to the topic at hand, I think some of the things that we try to do in remote work, thinking about equity, is trying to see the human code that people have, because right now, we all have like kind of a presentation layer. And so once you get to the source code, you could really understand why people behave a certain way. And once you understand the source code, then you can actually figure out how to change the presentation layer of people. And so I really thought, and I appreciated how the different, I don't know, the 15 different versions of Fast and Furious, I don't know how many there were. But I liked how it evolved from the first one, which was just them fighting it out because one was a cop and one was, a criminal. And then eventually they went on missions together to solve problems.
Funny fact about Fast and Furious. Ask me how many minutes of Fast and Furious I've seen.
David, how many minutes of Fast and Furious have you seen?
0. I have never
What?
seen a minute of Fast and Furious. I know there's like 9. There's like 9 of them or something like that. I don't know how they can keep going, but they do every summer. But somehow I haven't seen 1 minute. But I appreciate the analogy, and I actually think now I'll at least watch one, maybe. Okay, so thinking, moving from the idea of the importance of relationship, because there was something that Anthony used to that really stuck with me, the source code piece, right? I feel like,
What piece?
The source code.
Oh yeah.
Like something that just stuck with me that I want to just add on to, which I thought was brilliant on your point, is that we often layer on so many pieces to us that it's very hard to get to the core and really know a person and really appreciate a person for who they are. And because we're unable to get to that core, we often don't know what the person needs to be successful. And therefore we think we know, and therefore we don't set them up for true success. And so the importance of really getting to know the person, understanding the person, and seeing what makes them tick to ultimately make them successful is huge. Go ahead.
That's a good segue for episode 3, right? Because that's what we were planning on talking about, how teams function.
That's right. And I'm just going to say it out there. I think Elizabeth is chiming in. She has never seen any of them as well. Just to let you know, I'm not the only one out there that hasn't.
We're going to do a Fast and Furious viewing party next.
Right. Random clips thrown into our conversation. All right. So I have a question for you. And this actually is probably really timely, given that I feel like I have a ton of energy right now. What keeps you going from avoiding Zoom fatigue?
I always try to understand the value and what my alternatives are. And for example, this weekend, I attended a virtual graduation. It was for ALAS, and it was a cohort of superintendents that were graduating from a leadership academy, and it would have happened in Portland. Then on Sunday, I had a meeting with a guy in New York trying to come up with an online summer program. And if I had to fly to these meetings, I would have been flying, Friday to this graduation on Saturday, and then taking probably a red eye to get out of Portland to New York, and then literally just coming in late on Sunday night. And I was able to do both without leaving. And then I thought about what it would have been like if I actually went in person. And I'm not sure if I would, like, going to the graduation was nice to be present, but I wasn't a speaker there. I was, supporting some of the work, but I don't know if I would have provided that much value or gotten a whole lot of like direct value myself. And I felt like the virtual graduation was a perfect way for me to engage in something and not make a huge investment. And same thing with this New York meeting. I probably would have gone to New York because it's a new relationship I'm trying to build, but now we're forced to build relationships in different ways. And I saved a ton of time, and I had a lot of time to just like think and do other things that I wouldn't have gotten to. And when people ask me like why about like Zoom exhaustion or fatigue, I actually say I'm not that tired. Like, this is a lot easier than landing and going through airports and schlepping your thing and running through baggage claim or whatever, doing all those things, getting stuck in weather. Like physically, this is less tiring for me. So I have a lot of energy, but I think what I don't have is when my meetings are back to back, I don't have a lot of space, and I need to work harder in creating that space. Just the one thing I would add about work-life balance, I'm kind of thinking that work-life balance is more like, oil and vinegar. People think of it as oil and vinegar, like two separate things, but if you stir it enough, it becomes emulsified and it becomes one thing. And so I'm just thinking about what are the things that actually stir it up so that my work life is more emulsified, I guess. And I'd be curious, like, where are you on that spectrum? Are you still separated? Is it integrating? Where are you with that?
I will say, coming from school environments where you have to almost uphold a very professional position and perspective and only letting people into a certain degree, that I tended to, kind of keep my boys away from the conversation, and like they had to stay downstairs and, like all these things that I just realized in this environment, they're a part of my everyday life and work. And so, I mean, literally, my son is about 8 feet away from me right now watching Onward and Disney Plus, right? So it's just a part of work now in a way that I didn't imagine it to be possible at one point. But now, given the spaces that we're in, that's where we are. And I think a lot of folks out there that are watching or will watch it later need to hear the importance of, bringing the two worlds together, because it actually helps us kind of live our lives authentically. And I think the more authentic we're able to be virtually with the people that we work with and the family that we're near, the better we're actually going to feel. So this idea of being fatigued changes. Yes, back-to-back Zooms are absolutely draining, but it's nice to have this ebb and flow. Like our conversation is re-energizing to me because it's very natural to just have a conversation around things that we care about deeply. And then be able to walk away for a few minutes. I think our next call is right after this at 4:35 or something like that. And we'll be on the call again, but I'll walk away, talk to my son for a few, and then jump right back in. And I feel that cadence is fine as long as you make the worlds of work and home actually one. And I feel that allows for me to be more authentic. And I would add like the equity lens to that, right? I think if more work environments, virtual work environments, invited home into work in a way that the person feels comfortable, we would have a better way to find out what people need to be successful from their workplace, right? So I was on this call earlier today, and this guy's daughter ran into the screen. And I don't remember if you remember that viral video like a couple of years ago where the dad was like on a big meeting and the daughter came in or whatever it might be. But in this situation, I didn't even flinch. And so now, you could see just like the weight of him kind of just fall off, like he could be himself, be authentic. And then I was able to engage with him deeper so that he could get what he needed. So I think there's a piece of us allowing authenticity, allowing voice to come in the conversation that may have been taboo a couple of years ago in the virtual work environment.
In these conditions, what are some of the visual cues that you notice that might help somebody better notice that there's an inclusion issue, or someone's reacting differently? Because it is harder to see certain things like body language when your face is like right in here, right? And so I'm just curious, what are some of the things that you're noticing that might help our audience better reflect on how to create a more kind of equity driven practice in their remote work environment?
Yeah. Forget the study. It was a few years ago that talked about, a lot of what we interpret from people is 90% of it's body language and 10% is actually the words out of people's mouths, something like that. And so now with the virtual environment where everyone is a box on a screen, you're looking for things a little bit differently because you don't see all the body movements necessarily in every call. Usually folks are pretty frozen and locked in. So there's a few things that you look for. One, I find myself even looking for and doing a more intentional nod when I understand something, right? So not only just the slight nod, it's more of an up and down motion so that there is that visual cue that people are following along. Thank you for modeling, Anthony. That's great. The second is when we're in these conversations, I think there are moments in which we look for the pause and who responds after pauses. And so when we pause between comments or we throw out a question to the group, one thing I look for as I read the screen is to see where the eyes of folks are going. Like usually you can tell if someone's about to try to push the mute button off, or if they're really in deep thought, because usually someone's now looking up at the sky. But there are things that you kind of look for to see where they are, to see when to maybe push or pull from them. I was on a call the other day with a couple of internal folks, and I'm starting to read their language when they're in deep thought. And I know, all right, I can come back to this person in a second. They're still thinking, but I know this person who is nodding vigorously is ready to talk. And so those motions, those visual cues are important. I think the other equity piece that I don't want to lose out on is the fact that sometimes they're not visual, and sometimes we have to figure out how to engage folks who are maybe not engaging visually. So potentially going to thinking about how to use the chat function, or how we think about using verbal cues. I know in one call it was kind of fun where we started to use some old hand signals to say like check, like we understood it. Like we did different things to engage each other that kept it pretty level of the playing field, so that people didn't feel verbally committed to speaking if they didn't have a ton to say, but were engaged in a different way. What are your thoughts?
Well, as you were talking, I've read a couple books on body language, especially by some FBI agents. And as you were describing, I was like, it kind of is like you're looking into an interrogation room. And I could see why that sometimes when there's an interrogation happening, people are behind the glass, because it's much easier to observe behaviors when you're not physically present in there. And when you mentioned that, sometimes people like look up and, it's so much more obvious in this environment when someone's trying to think or come up with an answer. And I have noticed that when I see the eyes kind of looking up, I have to more intentionally pause to give them space to respond, because I know they're thinking, and I know for myself, if I jump into the next topic or say, oh, okay, no responses, and I move on, I passed up an opportunity for someone to contribute.
What makes that so hard, Anthony, because in meetings where we see each other all the time and we're sitting next to each other, and this is also, unfortunately, happens in classrooms all the time, we look for the first person to answer so that it can keep the conversation moving with a cadence. But there's something about that patience and wait time that I think is so vitally important for folks that process differently, for folks that may be part of a marginalized group in the room, right? So if you can imagine myself as a Black male sitting at a table with people that don't look like me, my apprehension to jump in is going to be higher. So therefore, I'm going to need a little bit more time to feel comfortable engaging. So in this virtual environment, the pause seems so much louder, if that makes sense. The silence is so much louder because we're by ourselves in this room and we're waiting to see someone to respond. But that's okay. And we just have to, part of that routine you were talking about, getting used to extending that wait time a little bit longer, and then finding ways to engage folks as we go in that conversation to make sure all thoughts are considered.
Yeah, I think this will be a good topic for the next episode 3, where we do talk about how teams can respect each other as individuals, both, thinking about, this conversation around different work styles is coming up a lot. I think it's something that a lot of organizations are trying to deal with and working out. And it's hard to, I just find, I remember you had mentioned the sports analogy, and I'm just thinking about like basketball, and why people like bring people, rookies in, and, how they train them into playing. And there are a lot of mistakes that kind of have to be made in order to get to a level. And it takes a long time. And so as an organization, it's hard to think about how to make those investments in a long-term career trajectory for somebody. Mm-hmm. We think so short-term about like onboarding, both in organizations like ours, but in school systems, like there's almost no onboarding.
Right. I mean, onboarding in some districts is like, here are your keys to your room, and here's the textbook in which you'll be teaching from. And I'm sure there's a few folks out there that either had that experience, or I've heard of an experience like that. And because of that, I mean, if we think about education right now, one of the most alarming things is the number of teachers that are leaving so quickly, right? Teacher retention is a big issue. We see all-time lows of Latinx and Black Americans going into the profession, let alone staying in the profession. So there's just these alarming facts across the board that should make us rethink about how we invite people to our work environments and make sure that they're part of the work environment, not something that is just thrusted upon them. So they're set up for success in the long run. I think a lot about when you think about sports, I mean, go back to your sports analogy, think about the programs or the organizations or the coaches who get the most out of their players. There's a few things they do really well, and that's build the culture that allows you to grow at the pace you need to, and ultimately get the best out of you by making sure they kind of poke the right button along the way, right? So like, again, Michael Jordan's on my mind. All you had to do is say to Michael was like, you can't beat me. And then that was enough. That's all he needed. That was the light that he needed to completely torch you to, you know, score 63 points in a playoff game in the Boston Garden, right? Because he was told that he wasn't good enough to play on that stage. So I think it's just a lot about how do we help people in our organization find that switch to make them feel good about being in that work environment so they can excel.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to dig too much into that conversation, but you did make me think, because I was watching Last Dance also, and I was like, why is it that oftentimes like the first draft pick though isn't as successful as we always imagine? And Jordan was like the sixth draft pick, right? Fourth, third. Okay, yeah. So I don't know. It's just a curious thing that I think we could kind of dig into that a little bit in the next episode.
Absolutely. I'm excited too. And I think was it Malcolm Gladwell? Well, no, who wrote the talent code again? I forget. Daniel Coyle?
Oh, the culture code. Yeah.
Culture code. Okay.
Yeah.
Where they talk a little bit about that kind of phenomenon.
Yeah.
You know. But again, I guess number 2 in that draft in '84, just to go to that draft, was Hakeem Olajuwon. So he turned out. So I guess let's close out. I don't see many questions from the audience today, but if there is a question or two, feel free to throw it in the chat before we start to close out. But what are some final thoughts, Anthony, that you're thinking about as we close out about this conversation as individuals working in remote work environments?
At least what I've been trying to do is, one, practice more noticing, and 2, trying to be more intentional about how I engage online. Probably the one thing I think is hard for many folks is they end up kind of blaming the condition for their dissatisfaction. And I think there's part of it, there's some things that are out of your control. There's also things that are in your control. And I do think that everybody has time to has the opportunity to make time for reflection, even if it's 5 minutes. And the more you start doing it, the easier it becomes to incorporate 20 minutes or 30 minutes. And so, yes, there are situations where you get dragged here and there and you don't like it, or, you wish XYZ didn't happen late at night, or this whole integration of work life you're not too happy about. But there are a lot of things about this condition that we can't change. And so why not try to optimize for that, as opposed to saying that, you can't be as effective just because of the conditions that you're in. And it's really trying to find how you're going to be effective in the conditions that you have. That adaptability is so key. And it is a combination of not only your environment, but what you personally do in that environment. How about you? What do you think are critical for bringing more equity into this kind of work environment?
Yeah, I think the slogan that probably sticks out to me more than ever is the notion of seek to understand before being understood. And I think too often in conversations, we are looking to be understood instead of understanding a different person's point of view or perspective. And in this virtual environment, we're almost forced to pause before we speak because we have to find the unmute button and then be able to speak. So it forces us to be a little bit more patient. But I think the byproduct of that is we're becoming better listeners first. Because there's about 40% of what someone is saying in the previous statement you're probably not listening to because you're ready with your point. And that 40% could be the difference of making a decision that goes slightly right or to slightly to the left. And now that we're in this place that we have to seek to understand first and really listen completely, it actually gives us a fuller picture of individuals, but actually of their thoughts too. I think the second piece of that is the reality that a lot of what we tend to do, and I'm probably overgeneralizing, or what I've seen personally, is the idea that people want to ensure that they have like 4 or 5 points that they want to connect to this larger conversation. And no matter what time of the conversation, they're going to inject those points, right? At a certain point. I just remember so many meetings where I left feeling like clearly X person came in to get this off their mind or into the conversation versus coming with an open mind and being receptive to perspective. And I feel like we are now in a place where we can create a space for perspective, where we can create a space for connected conversation that allows us to attack the challenge versus the content that someone might be presenting. And so I feel so much better actually being in this virtual environment because those things are almost naturally forced upon us to take place. But I also think we can even do a better job intentionally setting those things up to be successful.
I guess one last question I have is I have noticed that like before, if I had a meet in person, I was not satisfied with a 10-minute meeting. Now I am perfectly satisfied with a 10-15-minute meeting because the effort is so much less.
Yeah.
I'm curious, like, do you have that kind of notion as well, that it's okay to have a 15-minute meeting online versus like in person? That would have been almost unacceptable.
Yeah, I actually always lived by that. So even in our school system, I would want the person to submit like the ideas that they wanted to talk about in the conversation ahead, and then there was like 10 or 12% of the meetings just kind of fell off because they didn't really have substance to bring to the conversation, so they never happened. But then for folks who said, I just need 15 minutes, I said, great, let's start there. And then if we needed 30, I always had buffer on the back end. So I believed in 15 minutes is sufficient. But I think in the virtual environment, I love like 7-minute meetings. Those are the meetings where you get so much done, you get your ideas across, and then even though you blocked off 15 minutes, you got a ton of work done in 7, and now you have 8 minutes to like write or do whatever it might be. So I actually think the efficiency is a beautiful thing.
All right, I'm going to ask Google for that feature. The last thing I would ask the audience to give us at some point, just direct message us on Twitter or just follow up with us, is I think now I'm at the point we need a theme song.
Yes.
And so, if we could get some suggestions, I'd really appreciate. What's the theme song that would be appropriate for this conversation?
That's a great question. Do you have one in mind before we click off, though? Do you have any theme song in mind, or you just want folks to chime in on Twitter? Or
yeah, I don't know. I mean, unless something popped in your head.
I don't have anything. I'm kind of curious to see what people come up with.
All right,
we'll put
cool.
that question out there.
Yeah, we'll give away some free registrations to our upcoming events in June. Thanks everyone for joining us today. It was a blast having this conversation, and hopefully you find just these types of natural conversations really valuable for the work that you guys are doing every day. David?
Awesome. Yes, thank you all so very much. Please come back next week as we dive into conversations around team and the remote work. So we're excited to build on today's conversation. Thanks again for being here.
Peace.